right. Well, I think we've got the core of people who signed up, so we will press on. Good morning to everybody, and welcome to I guess the second Armchair Dragoons virtual game table. My name's Patrick Pence, and I am here today. We are doing a session on learning the great campaigns of the American Civil War system. So the presumption here is that you are, I think, Jeffrey, I think you said if you're completely new to the system, this is a great starting point for you. I put into the voice channel, or into the text table channel there, some links. First and foremost, if you want to watch along in your, aside from the streaming that I'm doing here of the Vassal module, if you actually want to follow along in Vassal, there's the link to the Here Come the Rebels 2.08a module, which you can download and follow along with. That way you are not beholden to the stream if I need to drop that for whatever reason. Also, I put links in there for my YouTube channel, which is kind of the germ of all of this. Was about 8 years ago I started recording these how-to videos for great campaigns, and I did about 5 of them, and they just went dormant. And with the advent of the COVID-19 quarantine period last year, I think we were all climbing the walls, and we were looking for creative outlets, and that's when I jumped back in. I created my YouTube channel with the intent of actually doing more in-depth stuff specific to great campaigns, but it has sort of evolved beyond that. And this is one of the benefits of this now. We've got a full-on YouTube channel with lots of content, so I put a link there to the playlist specifically for great campaigns. So it's again older, but it's you can go at your own pace on that. I've broken it into lots of individual topics. They're all indexed there in the YouTube video, so you can actually click on specific things as if you were going through the rule book. So you may find that that is a good backup to this, because I'm going to shotgun a lot of information at you guys today. And there's also a link to the Multiman Publishing website there for the current series rules, version 1.4, that were just released last month with the shipping of Hood Strikes North, which is the most recent campaign, or most recent title in the series. So I'm going to go into the presumption that we are all pretty new to this, and if you have any questions, probably the easiest way to get my attention is to type them if you're in the Vassal module, if you're watching along on Vassal, to just type them into the text channel there, and I will see them in the chat. Otherwise, I will try to periodically, I've got it kind of off to the side here, I will go back to the text channel and see if there's anything in there that is pressing. So, Tomislav, you are certainly welcome to browse. We're glad to have you here. So, with no questions to get started, unless you do have any questions, I'll be glad to answer those before we jump in. Don't be scared. Like I said, this is going to cover a bit of material, but it's all the most basic material for the series. And what you're seeing right here with this on our screen, I've pulled up scenario number 2 from Here Come the Rebels 2, which is the re-release and the repackaging of the second title, Here Come the Rebels, the third title, which is Roads to Gettysburg. So you get both the Antietam, Maryland campaign, and you get the actual Gettysburg campaign, so the 2 invasions of the North. And it's also packaged with Jubal Early's invasion, or attempt to take Washington in 1864, called Rebels in the White House. So that is a great point. It's not the absolute best place to start, but that is probably the most bang for your buck, because you get 3 titles with that. And they're all very fun titles. So I'm going to use that. I think probably the most played scenario from that, and it's a great teaching tool, is this multi-turn scenario called McClellan's Opportunity, and this is the lead up to the attack at Antietam or Sharpsburg, depending on which side of the Mason-Dixon you're on. And this, just looking at this screen right here, has essentially everything that I'm going to want to cover today for the basic, for the counters, the layout, the terrain, how leaders work, activations, all of that stuff. So we will thus dive right in. I see a couple of you. You obviously you have a manual mute on your system, so that's good. I don't hear any background noise. But if you do need to unmute and ask a question, I will certainly take them verbally as well. I'm recording this for my channel. Hey, so you guys are going to be internet famous, maybe. Okay, so just a real brief background of the Great Campaign system. I think if you've come across it at some point, you can see now that there's 13 titles in the series. It is the brainchild of Joe Balkowski from 1992. That was the first title. Stonewall Jackson's Way, which you see right up there on the top shelf, and that was the second Manassas sort of campaign. And it is almost year by year there in the early days when it was under Avalon Hill, up through on to Richmond, which was officially the last thing that Avalon Hill published. And then a few years later, Kurt Schilling, with creating Multiman Publishing, managed to get the rights for the Great Campaign series. And they picked up and created, under Ed Beach, is under his aegis now, Grant Takes Command, which was the Overland Campaign, and then it has subsequently gone several titles since then, the most recent being Hood Strikes North, which is where Joe Balkowski got to jump back in as a designer, which is fantastic. That is John Bell Hood's invasion of Tennessee in late 1864. I am playing through that right now on the channel with my sparring partner Roger, and those videos are online, so you can see how that's going. And those have been so much fun to play right through. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a trip back to 1862 today for McClellan's Opportunity, and I'm not going to be actually playing the game, but I am going to use all the bits and bobs and pieces here to show you the mechanics of it. So I have my chart here. This is literally what I used when I was recording the videos to just kind of put them together in a logical order. This is almost going through the rule book, the series rules, in that same procession. What I'm going to focus on mostly today is just the pieces, the activation cycle, which is movement, and a little bit of combat. We're not going to do much combat today. We'll do that more tomorrow, again, when we kind of reinforce all this stuff. But let's dive right in, shall we? So what you see here is, and what I love about this snapshot here is, in Maryland, between Frederick and Antietam, Sharpsburg, you have almost the entirety of the terrain chart. So the beautiful maps are kind of the selling point for the series as well. If you are not familiar with the scale of this series, this is an operations level Civil War game. So if you think of strategic level being sort of your Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis controlling all the stuff for the entirety of the war, all the way down to Terrible Swift Sword and the great battles of the American Civil War, where you are a brigade or regimental leader with on-battlefield tactical movement. That is the tactical scale. This is right there in between. This is the operations level, so you can see that each one of these hexes represents about a mile of territory, and each one of these units, the standard unit for this series is the division, which is the double X there. The Confederates have some smaller stuff as well. In some titles they have demi-divisions. We also see we have brigades and regiments here and here with cavalry. So the smallest we'll ever get is some of these regiments. But most everything is a division. It is named. And the pieces, what I did by choice on this one, if you're playing with these on Vassal in the last year or two, some of the more active players have, Alberto Romero is a fantastic Vassal designer, and he has created a system where it's an all-in-one, where all of the pertinent information for the game pieces is literally on one counter. So you have everything at a glance, which is great if you're very experienced with the system. But I chose to use the older tech version of this so that, as you can see here, when I hover over Rodman, you actually see what you would get if you had this on the table. So you have the Rodman division indicated there. you have a fatigue marker, and then you have a manpower marker. And all of those components together make up what you would see on the table. Now, that does mean, buyer beware, you're going to have some large stacks of counters. But most of us being wargamers of many, many years are already used to that, so it's not a big deal. So we're going to talk first about terrain. You can see here we have everything from this clear area over by Frederick that is literally clear. We have rolling terrain, we have rough terrain, we have a variety of creeks, which are the smallest water linear feature. Antietam Creek, which, against all logic, it is not a creek, it's actually a minor river, so you can see that you've got a large, thick blue line here. And then the largest river feature with the black border here is the Potomac. So you have everything from creeks, which give a small modifier, a minor river, to a major river. So on the terrain, a lot of this game, because it's operations level, is about utilizing the terrain to your best advantage. And by that, I mean specifically using the road network for movement. All of the roads here on most of these maps are created from county maps in the 1850s and 60s. So these road networks are as they were at that time period. And half the fun of this is for people who live in these areas, like friends that live in Atlanta, saying, "Oh, I'm this hex number on the map for Atlanta is ours." So that's kind of neat. So what I stress to new players often is this game is mostly about maneuver. It's operations. So we always talk about operations level games as getting the beams and bullets to the soldiers. That is the same thing here. Is we need to get these units from point A to point B and get them ready for battle. And then choosing the moment for battle is one of the key elements of this game, the skills that you need to learn through experience, because a lot of new players want to get in there. I myself am guilty of this. The first time I played this in a tournament environment, I said, I want to attack that stuff, and I didn't know what I was doing. So just because you can attack something in this game does not necessarily mean that it is appropriate to attack.
So we've looked at all of the terrain here. Let's reinforce these units and what it is. These are the pieces that we are actually using to prosecute battle. So we'll start with the leaders. We have first our army leaders on both sides. I'm going to pull them off to the side here. And they are obviously named. We've got McClellan and Lee. We've got their designation of their army, which is the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia. And we have a notation here of their command ability, and that will be important later on. Army leaders, for the most part, with some exceptions, everything that I will tell you today is with some exceptions. The Army leaders, their specific role is to attempt to initiate a grand assault. And when we talk about combat, there is attacking on the march, there's assaulting, and then there's the potential of doing a full grand assault, and that's where the leaders come in. In some scenarios, the army leaders have the ability to do a massive activation of many, many units based on their command rating on their chit. But for the most part, they are responsible for attempting grand assaults. Underneath them, we have the corps leaders. So in this case, we've got Mansfield for the 12th Corps and Sumner for the 2nd Corps, and then Longstreet with the Longstreet Corps. And they are stacked with one or more units underneath them. A leader must always be stacked with some infantry unit. We can never have an infantry leader stacked with a cavalry, for example. And an army leader he could be off with a specific division by himself. But most often, you will see him stacked with a corps commander. It's, again, not a hard and fast rule, but that's just, there are benefits to doing that, which we'll talk about a little later. And the leadership for the corps commanders is very similar, except now we have two numbers. The first number is their tactical rating. And we can see Longstreet has a 4, so he's got a pretty high tactical rating. And we have Sumner, which is a 3. For the most part, since the establishment of the series rules, a 4 seems to be, I can't recall if there's a higher one, but 4 seems to be the highest tactical rating. I believe in the original version, Jackson, who is down here at Harper's Ferry, I think Jackson actually had a 5 at one point, but now they've reduced it down to a 4 tactical rating. So that is an indication of their tactical rating, which we'll use in combat. And then the number to the right of that, after the dash, the 6 here, 6 on most of these, Cox has a 5. That is their command ability, and that is similar to what we talked about with Lee and McClellan. That is their, you will roll against that number when attempting a core assault from one hex to the next. And based on the strength of that number, you will compare that to a die roll, and that will indicate how many units within that hex, when we do an assault, are able to actually participate in the assault. So that is a relative descriptor or ranking of their capability to activate units for an assault. And then we come down to the individual divisions, and the divisions are named. The name of the division is typically the general that's in charge. So we have Rodman here, D.H. Hill here, and they also have 2 numbers. Now the difference with these 2 numbers is, once again, the large number that we see here is an indicator of their tactical rating. Now you'll see that on the whole, the Confederate units by themselves, without leadership, seem to have a better tactical rating for the most part. So you can see D.H. Hill has a 3, Hood has a 3, even Munford as a cavalry has a 2, whereas Rodman has a 2 over here on the Union side. Green has a 2, etc., etc. All the way down to some of these hapless cavalry units who have a 0. They have no leadership. It's just a bunch of guys on horses. So that is their indication of tactical capability. And then the second number for these divisional units is the number of artillery batteries that are attached to that. And that will be another indicator that you will use for comparative generating your die roll modifiers when making an attack. So if a unit with 2 batteries is attacking a unit with 4 batteries, there's going to be an inherent disadvantage when you're generating your die roll modifiers. And then while I've got them here, the other 2 pieces of critical information on every division that you will see is an indicator of the amount of fatigue that they have accumulated. And fatigue is an abstraction because each one of these turns is 1 day of time, and every unit has anywhere from 0 fatigues to 4 fatigues. And once they hit 4 fatigues, they are done for the day. Most of these that by setup in this scenario are, we also see they have a white stripe across the top. That white stripe is an indication of whether or not the division is exhausted. Exhausted as a status is a reflection of the amount of fatigue that they took on the previous day. If they got to fatigue level 3 or 4 on the previous day, then on the very next day that unit will become exhausted, which means they are more likely to become disorganized and stay exhausted as they keep trying to press those men farther and farther. So this is a wonderful abstraction for the amount of stressors that you are putting on these units in a multi-turn scenario. And part of the skill and experience of learning to play this game is, when do you push these units, how far do you push them, and when do you need to rest them. Now, not so much in the basic scenarios, which are anywhere from 1 to 5 or 7 turns, but when you get into advanced play with a campaign scenario, then you're talking 40, 50, 60 turns, and there's going to be an ebb and flow as these units, you march them hard for a day, and then you rest them for a day or 2, and then you march them hard again. So it's part of that cycle that you need to learn as far as how to use these units when you're marching them. And then we have the manpower indication here. It comes in 2 forms. It is organized, and you can see the nice soldier there in parade attention. And this is an indicator of his manpower. And when you see that number there, that it means it is, for the most part, infantry units. Each manpower level represents about 500 men. So this is about 3,000 individuals in this unit. There's also a disorganized side. So they flip over disorganized, and this can come as a result of an extended march. We talked about that it's possible for stragglers to occur and the unit to just kind of fall apart as they're moving around, or in combat situations as a result of combat, either attacking or becoming attacked. they can also become disorganized. Now, you'll notice the little superscript number here is 6. That means they still have 3,000 men in the unit. However, their effective fighting capability is reduced down to a 4. So when they're disorganized, the rule of thumb is they're about 66% as effective as they were when they're fresh. So that is also a consideration that you need to take. And when you do combat, you will always do combat either based on their full manpower if they're organized, or their combat value, which is this lesser number if they're disorganized. Okay, and they started that. So this as a whole, this stack right here represents a unit. And you can see informationally, we've got Cox here. He's got 3 divisions with him in his corps. And typically the Union will have 2 to 3 to 4 divisions within their corps. They're smaller, they're not as powerful as some of the Confederates, but they're numerous, which means that you have some other capabilities that you can use when you're attacking with them or marching with them. Okay, so let's talk about let's move on to the activation cycle. So all of this being said, oh, and I'll just touch briefly on the cavalry here. You can see that the cavalry works exactly the same way. The only difference is their movement rate, and they have some capabilities as far as doing what cavalry does, which is screening. One of the examples I'll use a little bit later with F. Lee is the ability to do a cavalry withdrawal when they are approached and threatened. That can help reduce the amount of potential activity that the infantry has when it's approaching, and we will see that a little bit later. But in this whole situation right here, we've got a lot going on. Historically, what's happening is the Army of the Potomac, as they've discovered General Order 191, right? They've got the 3 cigars, and they know that Lee is trying to move his forces back behind the mountains and potentially back behind the creek. So they are trying to press the advantage. That's why it's called McClellan's opportunity. He's trying to move these forces through those gaps or around the gaps and strike some kind of attack on Lee and Longstreet here. And the way you do this, all of this comes down to the activation cycle, which is a series of, it's the sub-game step of this. When we look at the sequence of play for this game for basic scenarios, typically you will have a random events phase, which may or may not be included in basic scenarios. More often than not, it is left out. That is for the advanced game. But then you will have leader transfer capabilities. So each side will have the ability to sort of restructure. If I wanted to, if I was really of a mind to, and say Rodman was down here, I may want to move Cox down to Rodman as part of my leader transfer, and I can do as many or as little as I want. I could move the army leader. I could say, oh, I want to bring McClellan down there as well. The limitation being that they have to be, for the leader transfer phase, they have to be within 10 hexes during this phase, and they cannot be obstructed by a zone of control. Zone of control is very common in war games. We're going to talk specifically about how it works here in a moment. But for example, if, let's just say in the most egregious sense, Hood was here, he's exerting a zone of control that would kind of cut off these leaders' ability to move through them to get to another unit that was kind of cut off and trapped. But with leader transfer phase, I may move any number of these units provided they are within 10 hexes. And that is one of the things that you will do at the beginning of the turn. You need to assess, all right, where does this leader need to go? Leadership inherently gives a movement bonus. So you want to, when a leader activates his subordinate units, he will give them the ability to march a little bit more effectively than if they were just activating on their own. And that's something we're going to talk about in just a couple minutes here. Once we do leader transfers, the Union always goes first, and then the Confederacy will do their leader transfers. We move on then to the activation cycle, the very heart and soul of the entire Great Campaign series. This is an initiative-based system, which means for every activation, the first thing you will do is roll for initiative. For my role-playing game fans out there, you're just doing this a lot. You will roll for initiative. Each side will roll a die. The high die roll will get the initiative, and they can perform some action with a single unit or multiple units if they're activating a leader. In most of the titles here, especially on the Eastern Theater, the ties will go in favor of the Confederates. So double ones to double sixes, any of those will go, and the Confederates will get the tie break. So statistically, they've got a slight advantage over winning initiative each time. And that is a consideration that can be exploited or at least used to the advantage by the Confederate player. It also gives the Union player a little bit of pause, going, I may not get the next initiative. So that is one of the things that you will take into consideration. So there are 4 or 5 basic actions that we're going to talk about, some of them in depth, looking at my notes here. The most common ones are march actions, assault actions, and then leader activations. The march and assault are both leader generated. So what I'm going to show you first is a unit can march by itself, but it's not the most efficient way to do that. So I could activate, for example, I could activate Rodman here and just say Rodman wants to move. And what you do is you first increase their fatigue by 1. That may have repercussions as far as causing them to need an extended march. In this case, it does, because he's exhausted, and as the marker says there, he has to make an extended march roll because he's going to fatigue level 2. The first thing you do is, I'm opening my chart here on the video, is you look at the movement. There are variable movement rates depending on if you're Union or Confederate. On the whole, once again, the advantage seems to be for the Confederates because they have an inherent movement bonus that is 1 better across the board than the Union forces. So that means that Confederate units self-activating, the divisions marching just by themselves, they will get a +1 to their movement roll, whereas a Union unit by itself would not. It's just a straight D6. Now this will again get modified in certain scenarios and in certain campaigns and titles, just depending on, for example, in the On to Richmond, there are lesser capabilities for Union marching, and in All Green Alike, which is the First Manassas scenario, there are restrictions that cause things to really slow down because it's early in the war and nobody's got any kind of battlefield discipline for maneuver. But here on the movement chart, if you've got that on your vassal side, you can see it. You can see the infantry and cavalry with a leader versus without a leader. And in this case, I'm going to move Rodman. I've added his fatigue to level 1, and then I roll a 1d6, and it's going to be not modified. So he gets a 4. And in this case, you simply move. And if I move across a terrain feature without a road, I pay whatever that cost is. So for rolling and clear, if I wanted to just move here, it would cost me 3 movement points. If I, however, wanted to do something a little more efficient, I could move along the road and go 1, 2, 3, and 4. And now I've moved 4 miles as opposed to just 1 mile. The one thing that you always can do, no matter if I rolled a 1 or not, is you may always move 1 hex, provided that the terrain is not impassable. So I couldn't go across a river without a bridge, or across a mountain or a swamp or anything like that. But even if I rolled a 1 for Rodman and I didn't have enough to go to 3213 because it would normally cost me 3, I can always slide. We call it the 1 hex slide. I could do that. Okay. Same with if I wanted to come back to Menser's Sawmill. Well, these rough terrain are like 5. So I don't have enough movement, but I can always slide 1 hex and get there. That takes you back to some of the old style 70s where you're just literally moving an entire counter just 1 hex because that's their capability. But the real trick of this game is understanding how to efficiently move these forces. Now, I showed you how we move, but before I actually move, in the order of operations is, after I find out what his movement rate is, because I have an extended march roll, I need to perform that. And that could have some bad repercussions. So I'm going to roll a 1d6, and it's a 2. Now, there are modifiers to all this, because there's modifiers for everything, but for the Union forces on the whole, they will get a +1 to all of their extended march rolls. And then it will get worse and worse depending on if they're already exhausted, and it could get really bad. And one of the charts you have for movement is the effects of extended march, which, depending on the size of the unit and the die roll that they make, they can suddenly start hemorrhaging manpower. Now, if they're already organized, the first thing that will ever happen is they will flip to disorganized. But if they're disorganized already and they start failing these extended march rolls, then they will start hemorrhaging manpower, and it will get less and less and less. So the worst case scenario is, for example, if you roll higher than an 8 and it's got a manpower, not combat value, but a manpower of 10, you could lose 3 manpower just like that because of an extended march roll. So you really have to want to move from point A to point B. And that's another consideration of, when do I rest these guys? When do I move? When do I not move? Conversely, a more effective way of moving units is to do a leader activation. When I do a leader activation, it allows me to do multiple operations with different divisions with a single leader role or single leader activation. Now, it doesn't have to be all of them doing the same thing. We have the capability in some of the other actions, what I'm not really going to talk about today, are burning. If they're on a depot or a railroad station, you could activate a unit. He's not going to march. He's just simply going to set fire to a depot and burn it down. Another possibility they have is to try to entrench. Now, that is a specific action that can only be done in certain years of scenarios. 1864 in this case. We are in 1862, so that action is not available to these units. They can only entrench at the end of the action phase as part of recovery. But that is something that you will consider as part of, I liken this to tools in the toolkits. And when you get into these 1864 scenarios, like Hood Strikes North in Tennessee, one of the capabilities you have is a unit will activate. He doesn't march. He just pulls out their field spades and they start entrenching or creating abattis or whatever. So I'm going to activate with Cox. I'm going to reduce this back down to 1. He is going to activate his entire corps to move. And the benefit of that is, again, you're getting to move multiple units. The downside of that, of course, if you're a gambling man, is if you roll poorly, that movement rate is assigned to all of the moving divisions. So that could be a bit of a problem. So I activate Cox. He's going to subsequently activate all of his units. They are going to get a fatigue, and of course they're all exhausted, so this means that they are all going to have to perform an extended march roll as they move. Again, lots of risk, lots of die rolling. Personally, I like to mitigate risk, and I think you can mitigate risk by making choices that are not going to cause issues. But we will see what happens here. So Cox is going to activate all of them to fatigue level 2, and they're going to march. And here's their die roll. Now, because he's a Union leader, he gets a +1 to his die roll for movement. And look at that. Perfect. I love that when these little examples come up in perfection. He rolled a 1. Terrible. But now they all get a +1, so all of those units can move 2 movement points. That's not great. Now, we talked about extended march rolls. You do all of the movements in sequence. I think a lot of new players, one of the mistakes they make is they just try to pick up the stack and just move the whole thing as a stack. That is not the case in great campaigns. You physically have to move them one at a time, and those choices are important because the order of operations means that you may have to exert more movement points as you go into a hex because there's a friendly unit already there. Just think about them pulling in all these divisions into a 1-mile area and setting up bivouacs here and camps there and whatever, drill, all of that. So there's an organization attempt that will require the exertion of more movement as you try to go from one hex to the next. But in this case, we got a terrible roll, which I love for examples. So I'm going to go through and roll each one of these units in order. And sometimes when you're playing with somebody online, you can expedite this thing. You know they're all going to move one unit because that's the minimum that they can move. So I'm just going to, from top to bottom, I would say, okay, here's Scammon's extended march. He gets a 4, plus 1 is a 5. He's okay. And then Wilcox's, he gets a 5. Uh-oh, that's up to 6. So now he's going to lose a manpower. So I decrease that down. And you can see his effective fighting went from a 4 down to a 3. And then lo and behold, Sturgis, here's his roll. He's okay. And then I roll for Rodman, and he gets a 3 also. So the only one that was affected by that was Sturgis. And in the example that I gave you here with 2 movement points, there's not a lot to do. I could move a couple units down here, but I really want to take Fox's Gap. So what I'm going to essentially do is I'm going to exercise that right to move them all just a minimum of 1 hex. And that entire core is just going to move up 1 into Fox's Gap. And then Rodman will just follow behind. That's a movement. That's a leader activation, and I was able to move 4 units all at once. But it was suboptimal, so that is the risk that you take when you're activating units with a leader. Let's talk about the movement of... Oh, thank you. Thank you for putting this back. Let's talk about the concept of zone of control, because that is so important here. Each one of these units, I'm going to move DH Hill for this example here. And let's say I've got... let's say that I rolled a little bit better, and Cox was able to move this unit down here, and he's going to ride along with. Every unit exerts a zone of control in all of the 6 hexes around it. And for an infantry unit, what that means is as soon as another unit enters that zone of control, they must stop. They can no longer march. And the choice they have at that point is, do they attack or do they just end the march action? And if they end the march action, you just roll for the next initiative, which could be a problem because if you've put yourself into a position where now you could be attacked because you did not win the next initiative, now you are twisting in the wind, as it were. So with zone of control, for example, let's say Cox moves here, he must stop. There's nowhere for him to go anyway because that road network does not go anywhere anyhow. So he has to stop, and he makes the decision he's not going to attack Hood next initiative. Okay. The exception to all of that, of course, is the concept of restricted zone of control. And that is assigned to these woods hex sides right here. Every one of these terrain features is considered to extend to the full entirety of these hexes. And woods specifically means that if a unit is outside and not connected by road to a woods hex side, they exert a restricted zone of control. Now, it is the same as a zone of control in all things except for one, and that is causing a unit to stop during movement. So let's say that Cox enters the woods here. That F. Lee cavalry unit does not exert a zone of control across the woods edge of that hex. So Cox can actually keep going with no impediment until he gets here. And now he has 2 zones of control that he's dealing with, and he must make his decision to either stop or attack. Okay? So restricted zone of control is one specific notation. It is related to woods, and for new players that is something that they kind of just got to get used to and wrap their head around. But you can use it to your advantage in areas with lots and lots of woods. You have the capability of kind of sneaking through these back roads to get around a unit because they are not going to stop you with a zone of control. The concept of force march. Let's talk about that. Let's say that Mansfield here wants to move green, and he really wants to get green down here to the Quebec schoolhouse. So he's going to activate green from an adjacent hex because he's in his command radius. The command radius for every one of these leaders is 3 hexes, so they can activate a subordinate unit up to 3 hexes away, provided that There's no interrupting zone of control from the enemy. So even though he's not stacked with green, he's going to activate green, and I'm going to place a fatigue marker on him, and we're going to set him up to march. He's in great parade order. He's not tired. He's not exhausted. So we're going to march him. And Mansfield rolls, and he gets a 6. Fantastic. So now that gives me new considerations. So we take the 6, we add 1 for the leader, so he's got 7 movement points that he can move. And he wants to, we're going to do this a couple different ways. First, I'm going to show you, if he just did a normal march at this point, he'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you ever want to enter a hex with a friendly that's already there, you must look at how many manpower are already in that hex. And that's going to cause, like I said before, to enter and sort of organize all those units into that little 1 mile area costs an additional penalty. So he's got 1, 2, 3, 4. He's got 2 movement points left over. We would have to assess whether or not he could actually stack with one of these units and get into that hex. Now, if I look at it's a clear terrain down there, and I look at my entering a friendly occupied hex, so he's got more than 11 manpower, so it would cost an additional 2 movement points on top of whatever that cost is. So it's 1 for the road and then an additional 2. So it would cost me 3 to go into this hex with couch. So that's not helpful. In addition, if I wanted to go into a mountain is even more extreme. It would cost me 4 movement points on top of the 1 for the road, so it would cost me 5 more movement points to get him into the hex with Smith. So these are also considerations that you have to make. Now, one option you have, if the unit is organized, and even if he had to make an extended march roll and he passed and he was still organized, then you could announce before your march, so I'd have to do it from back here, that you want to do a force march. And a force march is the example I give is the general riding up with the saber and smacking the soldiers on the back of that. Move, march, will you? What they will do is they will make a force march roll, which will add a few movement points, but it's going to cause them to become disorganized. So I'm going to announce I've got 7 movement points, but I really want to move them, so I'm going to force march them. So they have to flip. So they flip disorganized, and again, you can only do it if they are already organized, because they will then subsequently become disorganized. And then you roll a d6. Wow, I rolled another 6. Man, I'm on fire today. They take that number and you subtract 1 from it, and that gives me 5. So I take the 7 that I had and I add 5 to it. I have 12 movement points now. However, there is a penalty for this. If I roll a 1, then the minimum I will get with a 1 or a 2, I will get a minimum of 2 movement points in my force march. If I roll a 2 through 5, I'm going to deduct a manpower from that flipped unit. If I roll a 6, as I did, I will deduct 2 manpower, because that is just really causing stragglers. So I'm going to come down here and there we go. So I've lost 2 manpower in that, but I've got 12 movement points. So again, I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we knew that it was an additional 5 to get in here with the 1 plus the 4 penalty. So I now have enough to stack him into that gap because of the force march. So again, more tools in the toolkit when you're making these move decisions, whether or not you actually want to force march them or just take it and then get them to a certain point and then hope to get the next initiative to march them again. Because of the vagaries of the initiative cycle, you don't know if you're necessarily going to get the next one, or he's going to get a streak of 6 or whatever. I've seen 7 to 10 initiatives in a row by your opponent, and you're just sitting there pulling your hair out because all of your plans are like ash in your mouth, because you don't get to do anything, right? You just have to react to whatever he's doing, and that's great campaigns. All right, so that's force marching. So we've done all of the different flavors of marching. So I think it's probably a good time to move on to combat. We're going to do combat in a couple of different flavors. I'm going to, again, shotgun a bunch of information for you during this process, but it's really not difficult. The flavors of the whether you attack on the march versus attacking in an assault, really it's just the mechanical procedure that is slightly different as far as how you prosecute it. But again, it's a die roll modifier, and it is then you take those modifiers and add it to a die roll, and it's just a comparison. If you open up your combat chart here, you can see the combat results table. This is one of the features of the game that I encourage new players to constantly go in there and just look at it. It is a comparison of the attacker's combat value. Remember, if they're flipped, that's the smaller, the worst number, the lesser number, versus the defender's combat number, and whatever the net differential is between all the modifiers in your die roll and his modifiers in his die roll, whatever the net differential is, you're trying to obviously get a higher number, because the higher the number, the more damage you do to the defender, and the worse it is for them, obviously, as far as retreating is concerned. So the rule of thumb for everybody is what you're trying to do is you want a plus to win a battle in this game. You need a +2 die differential after the die roll. So you just need to have 2 more pips in your favor as the attacker, and you will have won the battle and caused the unit that's defending to retreat away, which is critical for, we didn't talk about some of the way you win the game is dependent on the scenario, but in the Antietam, in the McClellan's opportunity scenario here, we've got Sharpsburg. That's a victory point location. The Union is trying to get these forces in or adjacent to Sharpsburg, and the better that they do, if they occupy it, they get something like 50 points. If they are adjacent to it, they get lesser. But that's all part of the whole maneuver to get there and fight to achieve it. And the other way you win victory points in this game is to inflict manpower losses on the opponent. And in different scenarios and in different titles of the game, that can be a premium. Most of the early ones, it's +1, -1. So depending on if you're the person attempting to get victory points, as the Union, for example, for every manpower loss you inflict on the Confederates, you get 1 victory point, and you lose 1 if they inflict 1 on you. So part of the game is management of combat losses. And later titles, it will be something like +3 -2 or -3 +2. It really just depends on what the scenario dictates, but you don't want to be flippant. And this is just me talking. You don't want to be flippant about manpower losses. You really have to make the best attack possible, and if you're going to commit to an attack. And there's no guarantee, because of the way the 2d6 falls, that you are going to win a battle, even with all the best modifiers. All you can try to do is to get the best set of modifiers. And some people liken this to, it's like I need a CPA for this game. No, you don't. You just want to take all the considerations, you want to internalize them and figure out, and you learn this, what is a good attack, what is a bad attack, what is a rushed attack, what is a great thing. And as I said, there's a lot of modifiers that you can do in combat that will help your cause. So let's move on to combat. Let's talk about this first. Hooker. Good old Joe Hooker here. He's got 3 divisions underneath him, and he really wants to come and take it to General Lee down there at the bottom of the hill in Boonesboro. So there's a couple different ways we could do this. The one is he is going to send a unit first to probe, and we're going to send Doubleday. This is the example I used yesterday. It actually worked out pretty well. So he's going to activate Doubleday for a march, sends him to fatigue level 2, and he gives him a die roll modifier of +1, and he gets a 3. Not great. So he sends Doubleday down the hill, and old Joe's going to go with him, right? And we've entered the zone of control for a cavalry. Now, this is a little side thing, but this is a perfect time to talk about it. as you were saying, just you get to see this in context. Whenever an infantry unit, not a cavalry, but when an infantry unit enters or starts adjacent to a zone of control of a cavalry unit, the cavalry unit is given the option to do a retreat or a withdrawal. And what he can potentially do is, the worst case scenario is if he rolls a natural 1, he's going to lose a manpower, which means victory points for the attacker, right? That's a good thing. In the worst case scenario for the attacker is he rolls really, really high with some die roll modifiers, and basically they're doing a cavalry screen, a fighting withdrawal. They are sapping the movement points of the moving unit. So in this case, F. Lee says, he looks and he goes, well, I'm a 2 manpower and he's a 6 manpower, so he's 3 times larger than me, and he's probably going to attack, because you don't have to make your intentions clear. You just roll up onto the cavalry unit and you give them the option, and they have to assess, do I feel lucky? And in this case, F. Lee does not feel lucky, so he's going to declare a cavalry retreat. And what he does is he will add a fatigue marker. So whatever fatigue he's at, he gets 1 more. And if he's organized, he will now flip to disorganized. And because he started the cavalry retreat at a manpower of 2, that's pretty much the baseline. Anything below 2 manpower, you start getting negative die roll modifiers. Anything above 2 manpower, you get some positive die roll modifiers, which will help. Or you also take into account any terrain. So if it's across a river, you would get some benefits from retreating with the river in between you. But his is just a straight up die roll. And we're going to do this. He rolls a 6. It's happened yesterday too. This is great. So F. Lee rolls a 6, and you take that number and you divide it in half. And whatever that division number is a 3. That's how many movement points he is sapping away from the moving unit. So he has sapped 3 movement points away. He's got to now retreat up to 4 hexes away. He can go as far as 6. Now, we haven't talked at all about retreats, but the general rule of thumb before we get into retreat priorities is farther away from the aggressor and by road if possible. So he's gone 1 by road to here, and then he's got to go 2, which is farther away because he's now 1 hex farther than where he was, and he just keeps going by road. So 1, 2, 3, and then he can get to here, which is the minimum. He has to go 4 hexes. And then we will again address the priority charts. There's a priority chart 1, which says you must do these priorities if you can. And the priority 2 chart is a little more flexible. It allows you to do some free movement. Really, the only restriction is you just can't get closer to the unit. You can't go back into a hex that you've already come out of, and you can't be in a zone of control of an enemy unit. So it allows you the ability to, I can get some free movement out of this. So what he wants to do is now get across the river. So he's going to go there, and potentially he could go to either one of these because they're not closer and they're not in an enemy zone of control. So he's going to, I think he's just going to go, to that one there. So he crosses the river. So he went 6 hexes away. Well, Joe Hooker now and Doubleday, that effective screen as they were coming out of the mountains has sapped all the rest of their movement. They only had 2 movement points left. They're all gone now. So we would go next initiative, right? Let's say that they didn't. Let's say he had rolled a significant number and there was no impact on him, and he comes down and he manages to get out of the mountain. He has arrived at Longstreet's position with DR Jones and Evans sitting there. He has a 6 manpower. They have a 7 manpower. Let's say he's got 2 movement points left over. This is the point. He's entered the zone of control of another infantry. He must make the decision of whether or not he just stops or he wants to make an attack while marching. And when you attack on the march, you have, again, another decision. And you actually expend movement points depending on the level of attack that you wish to do on the unit that you've entered the zone of control. I'm going to open the chart here for the combat modifiers. And if you're following along Vassal, you can see these. But the attack summary is, depending on the level, the precision level of the attack, how much you want to set up for this attack on the march, you will get a die roll positive or negative modifier. So you could spend 0 movement points and do a column of route, which means basically they're in line and they're turning their rifles and shooting at something. The problem with that is it gives you a -3 die roll modifier to your attack. So not advisable. The only time it might be advisable is if you have such an overwhelming manpower ratio to a really tiny unit that you're attacking that you could offset that -3 with some other modifiers. So you don't often see a column of route. The next level up to that is hasty. Hasty is a -1 die roll modifier, but it costs 1 movement point. So again, not great, but if you only have 1 movement point left, you might want to make a hasty attack if you've got, again, superior force numbers. And then the normal attack on the march is 2 movement points. That is let's say he's got these 2 movement points left. He's going to expend those last 2 to make the attack on Lee and Longstreet there, because he's a gambling man. The best possible case is you didn't move very far and you had a really high movement allowance. You could expend 4 movement points. And every one of those numbers that I'm talking about is for infantry. It's double for cavalry. So whatever, like in this case, if I spend 4 as an infantry for a prepared attack, I would get a +1 die roll modifier. But for a cavalry, all of those numbers would become 0, 2, 4, and 8 instead of 1, 2, and 4. Because they get essentially a double movement rate. I didn't talk about the cavalry, but I will go back and we'll circle back to those and show you an example of how they move. So the only restriction to this is if they end up at that location with 0 movement points, they can't just say, I'm going to do a column of route, which is 0. They actually have to have movement points left over in order to spend 0. You can't just get there because of a cavalry retreat, whatever, and they have no movement left. You can't do that anyway. So he's going to make a normal attack here. So there's a series of die roll modifiers, and you may find, like on BGG or some of the other places, you can get a nice little checklist. Me, through experience, just constant play, I kind of have a mental order of the way. When Roger and I play, we kind of just tick off the boxes. We go from this to this to this to this. But the modifiers come down to essentially what we've just done. You've got type, right? And then you've got tactical ratings. You compare the tactical ratings. You've got things like terrain. So you got your 3 T's right there on the top. You've got artillery considerations, and then you may have you'll have manpower considerations, and then finally you'll have the possibility of flanking, and that's a little more advanced topic that we'll get to in just a bit. But so you've got 6 things right there that you can manipulate in your decision process when you're making an attack to improve your overall odds by getting positive die roll modifiers to your D6 roll. So we'll take them in turn just to explain what they are. Type, we've done. That is where you make the conscious decision of which level of attack you're going to make. Ideally, you're doing prepared attacks because you're getting a +1 movement or +1 rate to that. Tactical rating. So I'm going to put Lee off to the side here for the moment because he's not going to factor in. We've got Hooker. I'm going to do this as if we were doing an attack. Just kind of go through the numbers for you. So type in this one was a 0 because it's a normal attack. Tactical, Hooker is going against Longstreet. He has a -1 because he's a 3, and the defender is a 4. So that's a -1 to tactical. Terrain, there are no terrain features here in the zone, or in the attacking area, that are going to cause a problem. If you were attacking across a creek, that'd be a -1 to the attacker. If you're across any kind of a major or minor river or a bridge or a ford, that'd be -2. So you got to really want to attack. You can see why historically attacking across Burnside's Bridge or Rohrbach's Bridge these are destined to fail in many ways because of all these negative die roll modifiers that are abstracted here in the game. So it helps you historically to understand, wow, that was a really crappy attack. But that's what's going on here. So we've got a -1 tactical. We've got nothing for terrain, so that's a 0. We look now at artillery, and this is why I encourage everyone who's playing this to make sure that you're using the 1.4 series rules, because those are the most up to date, and they have changed the artillery rules from the individual boxes that you would buy from the 90s. So in this case, Doubleday's got a 4 artillery, and then the total amount of artillery that's sitting there is 5 between the two divisions. So he's going in at a disadvantage for artillery. And when we look at the combat chart for that, we compare, and this is what was changed essentially. It was this modification, this matrix here. You cross-reference the plus or minus differential between the attacker and defender on artillery versus the type of terrain that the defender is in. And in this case, the defender is in this light green rolling. So I'm at a -1, which is a -1. So that's a -1 for artillery. Not getting any better, right? Clear is pretty much the worst. In clear, open terrain, if you've got a good artillery battery there, that's going to cause -2 to the attacker. So you really got to want to attack or have, and again, the magic number is +2. If you come into any attack with 2 more batteries than whatever the defender's got, then that will get you a no effect. So artillery is just balanced out and it's not an effect. So more often than not, you want to make sure that you're attacking with massed artillery, or at least have more than the defender has if you're attacking on the march. And then we have manpower. So we've got the defender has 7 and Joe Hooker has 6. So again, he's coming in at a disadvantage. So the manpower differential there is going to be, it's a ratio, it's a force ratio, and that's also on the combat chart modifiers here. And if it is a 1 to, it's like he's attacking a 6 to 12 because you round in favor of the defender. Well, that's a 1 to 2, which means a -1. So another -1. It's just not getting any better. So right now, he's coming in at a -3 die roll modifier. I asked the class, does this seem like a smart attack? No. No, it's not. Thank you for answering. But Joe really wants to. He really, really wants to. Again, this is an experienced player saying the rule of thumb, and this is just me. A lot of people use the +2 because that's ideally what you're trying to get. They want to make attacks where they have at least a +2 differential in all the die roll modifiers. I'm a little more suspect of the dice because the dice hate me. So I personally like to do +3. If I can get a +3 advantage, then I'm more likely to make the attack. Okay. The one element that I did not talk about here, and I will give you an example of it here, but we'll go more in depth about it later, is flanking. Let's say that we had Cox somehow had managed to get all the way around over here. He is exerting a flank on Longstreet, and this is a way to get die roll modifiers. And this is the ideal. You want to make attacks where you're setting up these very nice, well-constructed flanks to attack and get a anywhere from a +1 to a +4 die roll modifier. And this can be offset. It's a 2-step process. And again, I'll go more into depth about it in just a little bit. But right now, this would give Hooker a +2 modifier on flanking, so that would help get him out of the hole just a little bit. Now it's just a -1 attack. Okay, so let's just say this example is as it is, and he makes a -1. We roll the 2d6, and when we're playing on Vassal, the convention normally is the Union is the first die, the one on the left. So we roll the 2d6, and in this case, I'm going to subtract 1 from it, and then compare it against whatever the Confederate rolled. Here we go. Hey, not bad. So it's a 4 to 3. which means it's a net differential of +1 in favor of the attacker. And when I go back to the combat chart, I would then go and look, I would compare the attacker's strength and then come down the matrix to the +1 and compare that to the defender's strength and look at the +1, and that will give me some indication of what the final outcome here is. Now, if you're looking at the combat chart, the numeric just means that's how many manpower losses that unit will take, and you can see it's a very bloody combat chart, which means that massed units attacking are also very likely, unless they overwhelmingly win the combat, they are going to take manpower losses from, and it's not just straight up casualties killed, it's casualties disorganized and, stragglers and just all the chaos of battle. So it's just a reduction of the effectiveness, the overall effectiveness of that unit that's attacking. So that's where I encourage people to really study the chart, look at the columns. People will game the system a little bit, and that's okay. It's all part of the abstraction. But you want to inflict the largest numeric differential on your defender as you can, and in this case it was a 7 for them. So yeah, again, so it's a disorganized, all of their units there would become disorganized. And let's see, they're already disorganized, so you can't make them more disorganized, but they would also, with a disorganized, they would gain 3 fatigues, so they would get all the way to fatigue level 4. So essentially you've shut them down for the day, right? Because part of the other tactical consideration of this game is I may not necessarily be able to inflict wounds and damage to that unit, but causing him to expend his currency, which is the ability to do fatigues and activations, is almost as good. So now I've got Lee and Longstreet shut down for the day, right? They can't do anything to me. Hooker would lose a manpower, so he would come down, decrease, and he would also be fatigued out for the rest of the day with his disorganized. And again, both of them are already disorganized, so you can't get worse than that other than a demoralized. If he had rolled really well and gotten at least like a 4 differential as the attacker, now you will cause them to become demoralized. Remember I said that the 2 differential is really what you want to do, because that will force a retreat. That's the small r on the chart. In this case, because he only got a +1, the defender actually has the option that he could do a voluntary retreat, and he may want to get himself out of harm's way for future initiatives, and he might retreat away out of their zone of control just to there. So that's sometimes a usable strategy to say, look, I was not forced to retreat, but prudence demands that I get out of this flanking position. And also, because he did not get a +2, he doesn't have the opportunity to advance to take the hex. He just got a 1D, which means he's blunted. So essentially a +1, that's the threshold for winning and losing a battle. You need a +2. The next big threshold is a +4, which puts the unit into a rout or a demoralized panic, and that will send them a minimum of 4 hexes, like we saw with the Cavalry Retreat. It's a minimum of 4 and a maximum of 6, and that gets them way out of the effective combat range for the moment. So that's attacking on the march, right? We did a few moving pieces there. With a leader activation, that's where you have the capability, if you had multiple units on the Union side, you can actually march them, set up these flanks with surrounds, and then the unit with the leader, or maybe without a leader, will come in and do a final attack. So that is one of the big considerations for a leader activation, is if you have the capability of getting a really great movement, getting all of these forces around an enemy to surround him, and then attack and put him in a bad position. Let's talk about assaulting now. Let's say that Hooker did get here, and I'm going to give him back some of this increase, and these guys, they're at 1. I'm also going to show you the most extreme flanking capability here. Let's say that Cox managed to get exactly opposite of Hooker. So we talk about an assault now. An assault works exactly the same way, the same die roll considerations. The mechanics are a little different. This is where the command ability of those units comes into play. I'll put Lee off here to the side again. We're going to do a couple of different things here. First, I'm going to show you just Hooker got into place, and then he managed to win the next initiative, and now he wants to declare an assault on Longstreet. So what he will do is he will commit a force, and this is the way that if you have multiple units in the hex, then if he had all of Meade and everybody there with him, and let's add a little bit to that. Let's make this. If we're going to do it right. So what he will do is he's going to commit both of these forces. They were at 2. They're going to go to fatigue level 3. Now with assaults, the great thing is it's not a march, so they don't have to do an extended march check. That's another one of the benefits of getting a unit into place and then attempting an assault. But Hooker is here, and he now wants to attempt to assault Longstreet with both of his units. They were at fatigue level 2, so the first thing I do is advance them a fatigue. Now they get that whether or not they actually get to participate or not. So that's a risk that you take. Now Hooker is going to make a command check to see if he writes down his orders, sends them to the couriers, and they can get to those subordinate leaders to actually get them to follow the orders and make the attack. And that's where the command attempt comes in. So we look at Hooker. He's got that 3-6. The 6 is his command rating. We're going to roll against that, and a 6 is always a failure. So you roll a 6, a natural 6, and that is it. It's just done. The orders never got there. They got cold feet. It started raining. Whatever. It just stops, and then you roll for the next initiative. And I've done that 3 times in a row. It kills you, but it happens. So he's going to roll against his 6. Here we go. A d6. He rolls a 3. So we subtract the 3 from his command rating, which means 3. So if he had up to 3 units in that same hex with him, if he had Ricketts in there with him, then all 3 of the units that he had committed to the assault could now actually participate. So step 1 is I say I want these people. Step 2 is I check to see if they actually get to participate. And that is not always the case. Now, with some of these leaders being 5s and 6s, you've got a pretty good chance. One thing I will point out is that if you ever roll if it's a 5 and I rolled a 5, that's a 0 differential. That still means 1 unit in the hex must go in. Okay, so even though I asked for 2, 1 unit must go in, and that's kind of the penalty you take. So you have to weigh the chances that I may not get everything that I want in the assault. But in this case, it comes off, and now I have 11 manpower attacking Longstreet, who's now got his 7. So we're going to do those same numbers again. This time the type is an assault, and when the assault is successful, it's the same as like a prepared attack. You get a +1 to your die roll. So that's a +1 for the assault. We look at tactical. Still, it's a -1 there, unfortunately, because Hooker's never going to be as good as Longstreet on this. Terrain, still a 0. Artillery now, we've got 5 pieces of artillery against whatever the Union has brought in, which is 7. There's the magic +2 that I was talking about. So 7 versus 5 is 2 more than the defender. So artillery in this case is not a factor. It's just no effect. So it's a 0. Manpower. This is another thing that finally worked out because of the assault. We've got now 11 manpower versus the 7 that's in there. It's still it's not a 2-to-1. It's still just a 1-to-1. So it's a 0 for the die roll modifier for manpower. And then flanking now. Flanking, I've got the best possible situation. I've got an incredible flank on Longstreet. I managed to get Cox all the way around. And he is now covering, I've got all 6 hexes either covered or with the presence of my units. So all 6 hexes are covered. And you do flanking and we'll probably, again, we'll come back to this in a little more detail, but once you have 6 hexes covered, you get a +4 die roll modifier, which is incredible for the attacker. But there are cases where that will be subtracted by the presence of impassable terrain or units friendly to the defender, or if he has a flanks refused marker. If he sees you coming and he gets an initiative, he could potentially do a march activation to put them into a refusing flanks formation, which will reduce the effectiveness of that flank. But we caught Longstreet completely off guard. Cox got around him. Hooker's making the attack now. So I look at my debits and my credits here. I've got 5 up, so 5 positive, -1 for the tactical. So it's a net die roll modifier of +4, which I will get. So here we go. Die roll modifier +4 for the Union, and slightly less. I was 1 pip short, but now I add my 4, so I got 9 to 6. So in this case, when I look at that, now I look at the +3 differential on the 7 that he has in there, and I've now inflicted 1 manpower loss. So he would have to choose from one of those units that's in that hex who to reduce the manpower loss from. It's his choice. Also, if he was in a situation where I had completely flanked him like I have, and he had to retreat out, and this is again some more advanced topics, but retreating, if he could not follow a road away from the attacker, then he would also lose more manpower losses. So one of the skills of the player that you learn is to try to set up these flanks to box in a unit such that if and when they have to retreat, they don't have usable roads or friendly units that they can escape through, and that will cause even more manpower losses upon the defender. And that's how you get more victory points, and you make it worse for the defender for subsequent turns. Okay, so he gets the 1D here and a retreat, so he has to retreat at least 2 hexes away, but he could go up to 4. So in this case, he decides he's going to reduce Dr. Jones by 1 manpower, and there's a handy dandy little victory point window up here that you can come and you can put the manpower. You can adjust the manpower, and what you will do is you add those throughout the game, and then at the very end of the scenario, once the however many turns are done, you look at the net differential between the high and low manpower losses plus victory point locations you've collected. So Longstreet takes that, and they get completely fatigued out, and he's got to go 2 hexes away. And if we look at our priority charts, which again, I'm not going to go too in depth at the moment, I'll come back to it in a little bit, but basically he has to go away from Hooker and then tries to get out of a zone of control. So that's 2 hexes, 3 hexes, and then 4 hexes. Because it's a small retreat, he has some flexibility that he could go to here, and then potentially he could come across the bridge and get to that spot, because again, he's not getting any closer to the unit that attacked him. He's not in a zone of control of the enemy, and that may be more beneficial for a future defensible position across that bridge. So that's attacking with an assault. All right, let's talk about the big dog now. We've got, let's say, I'm going to put Cox back down here. And let's say you are Lee in this case, and Hooker has wandered down off the mountain, and he's only got just, instead of this, he's just got himself and Meade, right? So let's talk about a grand assault. This is the biggest attack capability that you can do. And it, again, works exactly the same way mechanically, but there's just one little added nuance where you are utilizing the command ability of the army leader in an attempt to bring in multiple hexes or units from additional hexes that are adjacent to the defender. Now, one of the questions that comes up a lot is, do they have to be in command radius? No, they do not. just the person who is initiating the assault originally has to be in the command radius of the army leader. So in this case, Longstreet stacked with Lee, so there's no problem with that. If the grand assault were to come off, even though D.H. Hill is off by himself here, he's cut off, he could still participate in the grand assault. So that is something that people often overlook when they're doing this. All right, so let's say Lee or Longstreet is committing these 2 units to an assault. So they get fatigue level 2, and they're going to attack Hooker. Is it the best possible thing? We don't know. We're going to find out together. So in this case, we make a roll against Longstreet. Here's his command, and it's a 5. Womp womp. Okay, so he's a 6, which means I've got 1 unit because the differential is 1. So one of these 2 that I committed can actually participate in the assault. So obviously I'm not going to send Evans in with a 1. So in this situation, I would send in Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones is a 5 going against a 5. Now they're equal. That's cool. But what I want to do is I want to utilize Lee's capability to organize units from additional hexes to potentially bring in more manpower, so it might improve my manpower ratio, and it might overcome some artillery deficiencies that I have when I'm attacking. We could see that Dr. Jones is a 4, and Hooker's Meade's got a 3 artillery battery in there. So that +1 doesn't help us very much because we're still going to take a negative on the artillery. So what we want to do is now we're going to send a courier over to Lee and ask him if he will grant us the capability of a grand assault. So I need to check with Lee to see if I can actually bring in Hill. That's the grand assault. Now again, works the same way. If I roll a 6, it's just flat denied. It does not occur, and Jones is going in by himself. But if I get any other number, and a 5 in this case with the grand assault is a 0, that's also essentially a failure. So what I want is a 1 through 4, which will then indicate that I have the capability to bring in additional units from multiple hexes. So here's the check on Lee. It's a 6. Failed.
Well, let's say you rolled a 4.
Let's say I rolled a 4. Oh man, 6. There we go. Let's say I rolled a 4. I rolled a 4. Okay, so I would subtract that from Lee, his command. So that's a 1, which means I can bring 1 additional hex. Now this is an important distinction for new players. It's a full hex, which means all of the units in another hex can actually participate. So it's not just a single unit, it's all the units in a hex. So if I had Hood and Hill in this hex, they could all come in now if they wanted to. This is also useful, especially for the Union player. Sometimes through just the vagaries of movement and everything, you may get multiple corps stacked together. You may get divisions from the 2nd Corps and the 3rd Corps, and it's just a big old mess. Well, with McClellan and as an army leader, you could declare an assault with 1 corps leader that's there, and he may grant through the grand assault the ability to bring in other units from that same hex that were not activated. So even if you rolled a 1 hex and I didn't have anything else surrounding the defender, I could still bring in units from that 1 initial hex that activated even though they were not part of the same corps. So it's a good way to kind of mix and match units and just get more manpower in. But in this case, this is a pure kind of thing. Now Hill wants to come in, so we will advance him to fatigue level 2. So we'll run through the numbers here again, as you saw. So now we've got a type as a +1 because it's an assault. It's a tactical now of +1 because it's Longstreet attacking Hooker. So that's +1 for that. And if I open up, there are module and game specific modifiers for each of the titles. And because Lee himself, the army leader, is stacked with the origin of the corps with Longstreet, you get a +1 bonus in Here Come the Rebels because Lee is there, right? So we're going to get a +1 on top just because Lee is in there with the assault. There is no terrain again. We talked about that. There's no the artillery now, as you pointed out, is covered. We've got 8 pieces to his 3. So in fact, we may have enough to put us into the beneficial column. So let's open up our combat modifiers here, and I'm attacking with, I've got a +5, which is the next column, and I'm attacking into rolling. That would give me potentially, I'd have to make a die roll check, but potentially I could get a +1 for an artillery benefit. So I'd roll on that, and it's just even or odd. So if I get an even, then I get the +1, and I got an odd, so no artillery is used. Let's double check. That's the for the last. Yeah, so I rolled an odd, so there's no artillery. It's treated like no effect. But I have enough to cover it, so it's not a negative modifier, so it's just a 0. So that's there. Now with manpower, I look at my manpower total. I've got 11 manpower attacking 5. Well, that now is 2 to 1, so I'm going to get a +1 for having that combined manpower. And then finally, I don't have a flanking in this situation, so it looks like I've got 4 in my favor with no reductions, no negatives. So it would be a +4 to the attack for the Grand Assault. So let's do that. Here we go. +4 Confederate. And ooh, that was not good. So this is a perfect example. It's a +1 because it's now 6 to 5. But with all of that manpower that came in, a +1 with 11 manpower is a 1D. So basically, I caused damage to myself as the Confederate player, and he has 5, and all he got was a D. So basically, that is a repulsed attack because it was at +1. Otherwise, if it had been +2 or higher, he would have had to retreat back up through Zittlestown, through the mountains, toward his side of the army. So there's never a guarantee. Let me say that again. There's never a guarantee. The 6-1 split is very real in this game. You can have all the modifiers in your favor and still roll a 1, and he rolls a 6, and you are not necessarily guaranteed a victory. So that is how you simulate the friction of combat in this game. So we've done attacking on the march in its various forms. We've done attacking from an assault position, and then we've done a full grand assault with all of the modifiers. That's combat. I mean, you've learned enough to be dangerous on combat. Okay, well, I think the last thing that I want to talk about then is flanking specifically, and retreats, because those are the last 2 things that you really need to know to get
Cavalry.
And cavalry. Yes, let's do the cavalry. So a cavalry move works like this, pretty easy. We activate them, they get a fatigue, and instead of a 1D, they get a 2D. So I'm going to roll 2D, and with Confederate cavalry, they get an inherent +1. So this 8 becomes a 9, so they can go 1, 2, 3, 4, and he may want to get into the 8th New York's face. He's got 4 left over, or 5 left over, so he could make a normal attack. And if we look at the capabilities here, I mean, he's at a 1/2 manpower, so he get a reduction on that. So it'd be a -1, but he's getting a +2 for his tactical ability, and there's no artillery. So you'd look at +2 -1, so it's a net +1. Is that a good attack? Maybe. You will see a lot, as you're playing this, you will learn to kind of calculate the stuff on the fly. If you've ever watched any of our videos, I cut out most of that where Roger and I are like, and we sit there for 5 minutes going, maybe. I'll cut that stuff out. But in this case, he could have a +1 attack, and it's not ideal. And for cavalry, anything that's the rule of thumb, again, I'm trying to give you some of the wisdom here. Anything that's 1 to 3 manpower, it's very difficult to inflict manpower losses without overwhelming modifiers or superior numbers. So, you'd really have to want to attack this 8th New York for some reason, but it may not be the best attack ever. So that's how cavalry moves. Cavalry is great for screening, as we saw with Fitz Lee up here, kind of slowing down Hooker on his approach. That is their primary function. In some scenarios, they have the capability to burn. We didn't talk about it, but their job is to go out there and damage railroad stations. In the advanced game, you want to cut rail lines as they want to do. So that is Jeb Stuart's job. He takes his cavalry out there, and typically there's two states of causing destruction on a railroad. You can either damage it, which means it could potentially be fixed at some point in the scenario, or you can destroy it utterly. But cavalry, more often than not, they just they do mischief out there. They damage it. They don't destroy it. But in some cases, in some victory point schedules, that's worth some points as well. So that's cavalry. They get in behind, they do damage, they do screening, and an effective use of cavalry is really, if you can get them into a good defensible position, they can slow down a large moving infantry force for as long as you need to reconstitute your other defenses. Okay, let's talk about then flanking, and we see Jeb Stuart down here. Flanking is, we've seen examples of it thus far. There's really two states. When you are setting up a flank, I'm going to use Cox here as an example, there are some restrictions. The unit that's attempting to be the flank, to pin the unit behind them, they must be undemoralized. So Scammon in this case is undemoralized. They also must be at least 25% the size. So if there's a huge stack of units and you've got 20 or 30 manpower there, a small unit like Scammon here with 3 manpower, if he's not at least 1/4 the size, he's not exerting a flank on that larger unit. So those are considerations again. Another factor is the presence of restricted zones of control here, where if the unit is attempting to exert a flank on there, but they don't have a connecting road, let's say we're trying to do one on DH Hill here, the first thing you do is assess how many total hexes are covered initially. In this case, we've got a great flank. We've got 6 hexes covered by the 2 units. But then the second step is to reduce that by things like, in this case, we look at the restricted zone of control of 3011 here. If Hooker is not connected to that hex by a road, then it's going to be for it in the first step and then reduced in the second step. Okay, so this would reduce the attack on Hill from a +4 flank down to a +3. And the other factor is the presence of units friendly to the defender, adjacent to the defender, will also reduce that flank. So in this situation here, we've got 6 hexes covered. 1 of them comes off in the second step, so it's now a +3. And then another one because there's a friendly adjacent, so it's now a +2. So that +4 flank has been reduced down to a +2. Now, with a full flank like this, where you have initially a +4, no matter what the reduction is by impassable terrain, mountains, rivers, swamps, whatever, or friendly units, the worst it can ever be reduced is to a +1. So you will always get at least a +1, assuming again that you've got 6 hexes covered. That is not the case if you've got, in this case here, where Cox is here, we've only got 5 hexes covered. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 initially, and then that's a +2. Now 2 of them are going to come off as we did before. This one because it's woods, and this one because it's friendly to the defender. So that +2 is now reduced to +0. So this is considered no flank because they've got tactical considerations that help improve, offset the flank. Okay. The other thing that can offset is if a unit gets into a location where they expect in the future that they may get surrounded, they can place a flanks refused marker here. In which case, this will initially, I'm going to give an example here. I don't have the friendly adjacent, but this is a full flank. I've got 6 hexes covered again in step 1, but we're going to reduce this by 1 in step 2, so that's now a +3, and then the flanks were fused essentially cuts it in half. So this would bring +2 or +3 down to a +1. So flanks refused is a great way to, if you know that they're setting up this massive flank on you, you can put this out there and reduce the effectiveness of a +6 flank or +4 down to a +2. So that's every little bit helps. All the reduction that you can do in the die roll modifiers helps in this case. Here we've got this. If I had this here with the plus, this would be, work with me. It's 6 hexes covered, so it's 4 to start, then reduced by 1 for this, which is a +3, and then reduced by another one, +2, and then this one, again, the worst it can reduce it down is to a +1. So it is a +1 final flank. The other benefit for the attacker is if, let's say that we didn't even have a flank, he's anticipating a flank and he puts up a flanks refused marker, but there's actually no flank anywhere around him. The attacker would get an inherent +1 bonus to his attack just because of the weird setup of the battlefield on the defender side, anticipating a flank that's not actually there. So he is.
So be sure before you place it.
Exactly. So there are times where you need to be, you need to be sure that what's going to occur is going to actually happen. So that's how flanks refused work. So you've just seen the long and short of the flanks. Flanks is by far and away what we see on Consim World in that thread. That is the one question that comes up most often. Also, we have a Facebook group for great campaigns that I encourage everyone to, if you use Facebook, to go out there. It's a very active community. Like Consim World, you kind of have the ear of all the designers. Joe's in there, Ed's in there, Chris is in there, and a lot of very experienced players. So not only can you find places and opponents there, but you can just throw out a quick question and say, or do a snapshot saying, "What's the flank here? I'm not sure." So as you're learning, because there's always going to be considerations because of terrain modifiers and flanks refused and rivers and things like that. So don't feel like you're doing something wrong or being overwhelmed. Even I mean, if you watch some of the videos with me and Roger, every now and again I'm like, that was bonehead, I completely miscalculated that. And it also should be said that one of the skills that you will learn is to set up flanks just kind of on the sly, right? In this case, Cox is exerting a zone of control into these 2 hexes, lo and behold, and Hooker is extending into these 3 hexes. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hexes covered. So that's +2, and it would then be reduced by this one because of the woods. So this is still a +1 flank, even though the unit's not immediately adjacent to DH Hill. So you can actually get very creative, and that's one of the, I think, the positive benefits of the Union with all of these very diverse cores with lots of smaller units. They can get out there and surround units and set up these flanks. Not only because you want the flank modifier for attacks, but you also want to make it untenable for if he has to retreat. In this case here, this would be a really bad retreat. This is a good segue into retreating. Hooker attacks and he manages to inflict a retreat on Hill. Hill must get away from Hooker as the highest priority on the priority chart. And again, all things being equal, the highest priority is get farther away by road, and then get farther away without a road, and get, etc. And then if you can't do that, you're still adjacent to the attacker. That can cause manpower losses. So in this case here, Hill has to get away from Hooker. He's got essentially 3 options. Let's say, let's do this here. We got that cavalry set up there. He has to get away, but he can only go here, here, or here, right? His highest priority is to get away, but he's still in a zone of control. So there is a way. Let's do this here. Let's make it even more extreme. We've got it so he can only go here or here. Well, he's going over land, right? If he's going over land without a road, every unit, let me stress that, every unit that's stacked in there, so there's like 3 divisions in there, every single one of those units would suffer manpower losses. So it is an incredible way, if you set up these flanks and force them into retreat paths that is untenable for them, that you can inflict additional manpower losses, maybe in lieu of actual combat losses. You may not have done anything from the combat, but if you force them into flight and they have to go to a position that they can't retreat effectively, they may lose manpower doing that. So that's another skill set that you learn through experience of this game, going, ooh, if you can read the terrain and you have the units to surround the defender in just such a way that you force retreat paths that are not good for him, then that's a way that you can score manpower losses. So there are essentially three types of retreats. We talked about the small R, which is on the combat chart, which is a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 4. So in this case, he could keep going here. He went his 2, and then he can cross there, right? Again, they have to follow the retreat charts until they get to a certain point that they can switch over to the lesser punitive retreat chart. I've got that here. So we can see the retreat priorities if you're looking at it in Vassal. Retreat priorities 1 through 5 will tell you what the manpower loss is, and it will give a description there in plain English of what that means. It's this situation, but not this or that. With the small retreat, you do the first 2 steps on retreat chart 1, and then retreat chart 2 is, again, a little less punitive. It gives you a little more flexibility. With a full rout, so that the next worst one on the combat chart is the big R, which is a rout. Not only are they going to have to move away 4 hexes minimum, maximum of 6, but they're also going to become demoralized. And I'm gonna put one of those. Let's say that the DH Hill becomes demoralized here. I'm gonna put a marker on him to show you what that indicates. There's 2 levels of demoralized, so a unit can keep getting hammered over and over again until he gets to demoralized level 2. But basically, demoralized level 1 means he attacks at half of whatever his strength is. So he's a 5 there, and it's always worse. So it's like a 2.5, which is basically a 2. And his artillery is 0 because all the artillery batteries have been scattered, destroyed, unlimbered, or limbered and run away, whatever. So that's demoralized level 1. On the retreat chart there, you can see there's an R star, the big R star, which means that's such an overwhelming attack that you would retreat, you would become demoralized level 2. And we haven't talked at all about recovery. I'm gonna end the action cycle here in a moment, and we'll do recovery and what that means for these units that have been utilizing these fatigues. Demoralized 2 means no matter what their manpower is, they always attack as if they were a manpower 1, which is terrible. And again, they still have no artillery. So you can force these units into really bad status by being demoralized. So disorganized just means they're not as effective. Demoralized means it's going to take them a while to reconstitute that force. And in this game, that means multiple turns. So we actually have in the Vassal module here a recover button, that's part of why we play with Vassal. If you were doing this on the table, if we had done all the actions that we wanted to, we keep going back and forth until one of 2 things happens. Either someone has won the initiative and says pass, and then the other guy says, well, I don't have any units that I can still activate, or he passes. So we have 2 subsequent passes. We end the action cycle for the day. That will end the turn ostensibly. Then you would go on to the recover phase, and all of the units, you will go through and assess every single one of the units. They can do a variety of things. So if they're at fatigue level 0, which means they did nothing for the day and they're in good order, they may become reorganized. They may dig entrenchments, depending on where they are. They may increase the entrenchments. If they were at breastworks, they may start building forts. If they're adjacent to a river, you could make an attempt to build a bridge, because bridges are great for rain turns when those fords become impassable and you really need to get your units across the bridge. So all of those fatigue level 0 units will get to do some things based on them sitting still for the day. Again, that's another consideration that you have to make about when to use these units. The other thing is, if we were doing this on the table, is we'd go around to every single one of the divisions and you would subtract 3 levels of fatigue from those units. So for example here, Doubleday, let's say he was actually at fatigue level 4. That means on the next day, he's going to start at fatigue level 1. So he's already tired and partially fatigued from the previous day's activities. So that is oftentimes the results of these combats. If they get to fatigue level 4, it's going to take them a little bit of rest the next day and then potentially resting that whole day to recover back to completely fresh. So you're looking at anywhere from 1 to 2, maybe more if they're demoralized, turns where you just leave them alone, do nothing with them, leave them at fatigue level 0, and just during the recovery phase they can potentially get reorganized or undemoralized, as it were. Okay, so if we were going through, like I said, we would sit there and go, and it's kind of a pain when you got stacks and stacks. You go, okay, let's take all these fatigue levels off. With the recover button, I'm going to hit it now. You can see what happens. I hit this, and there's 2 recoveries. If you're recovering in a sunshiny day, a normal day, then units that are at fatigue level 0 have the capability of automatically starting entrenchments. If it's a rain turn, you can't build bridges or entrenchments. So we have 2 different flavors of recovery there so that you can use that in Vassal and it won't automatically add entrenchments to something that doesn't deserve it. So we can see Hooker here was at 3 and Doubleday, as I said, was at 4 and he came down to 1. And any units that had achieved either fatigue level 3 or 4 for the day will then flip automatically to exhausted for the next day. Okay, so that's how the recovery cycle works. That's part and parcel what the game's all about. In some of the you can see here, Smith is starting breastworks, and in some, depending on when in the war the scenario takes place, some of them let them go from nothing all the way up to they've completed breastworks. In this case here, we can see in 1860, and you can see that chart on there, that nomenclature on there, that's incorrect because we're in 1862. You would actually have a couple of recoveries that would take that, where they go from building the breastworks, that takes a whole day, and then the second day they would actually complete the breastworks. So I think that's just an error in the Vassal file here. But when you get into 1864 scenarios, then you actually, I mentioned it before, as one of your activities when you activate a unit is they can, in lieu of marching, they can just dig in. They can start building, they can cut down trees and build an abattis. They can improve that abattis to breastworks, and then they can keep doing that all the way up to a fort. And the die roll modifiers are significant. You go from 1.5 for an abattis to 2 for a breastwork, all the way up to a 3 times modifier. So that means the defender in there, whatever his manpower is at a fort, is multiplied by 3. So a lowly 3 manpower can actually be 9 manpower, and it doubles or triples the amount of artillery effectiveness in there because it's an entrenched position. So that is one of the things in this game that is key, is, like Forrest says, getting there fastest with the mostest, or you want to get to a position where you can defend. In this case, you will see in this scenario here is lots of fighting withdrawal from the Confederate player to get behind Antietam Creek, and then the Union forces will slowly envelop around to the north, provided they get through the passes and they get good movement rolls. They'll come around from the north, and you'll have on the second or third day this cluster. It looks like a 4th grade soccer game where they're just all clustered around Sharpsburg, and you're just setting up these potential attacks for a final big set piece battle which occurs. That is one of the complaints that people have about this game is, hey, I'm playing Roads to Gettysburg and we didn't actually fight at Gettysburg. Well, if you're playing the scenario for Gettysburg, they preset a lot of that for you. If you're playing the full advanced campaign, you may not. You may have the Battle of York or the Battle of Westchester or whatever, because those maneuvering forces may come together in different places than what may have happened historically. And I think with that, I've covered everything that I wanted to for this. We've done 2 hours, so I will certainly open it up to questions for you. If you want to chit chat and see some examples, I am here for your benefit. Otherwise, I will open it for questions. We are wargamers. We have no questions. Well, I really appreciate everybody attending today and watching. And like I said, the links for a variety of resources are in the text channel. And if you ever have any questions or anything like that, feel free. You can send me messages here through Discord. My username there down at the bottom, or you can right click on me and send messages. And I would encourage you to go out to the YouTube channel, Patrick's Tactics and Tutorials. That link is also there. And if you could take a view of the videos, that's awesome. If you like the videos, even better. You can click the thumbs up and subscribing. You will see the content. We're trying to put out new videos every week. Roger and I are almost done with the basic scenarios for Hood Strikes North, and then we're actually going to play through the full campaign in increments of episodes. So we hope you enjoy that, but I really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. That was
for your
great.
time.
Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.